Hey y'all, Grown Black Folks Talk. On the Climb story time. I actually have two for you today, and this one is a wonderful story for those of us on the move. Over the weekend, I learned the difference between a hobo, a tramp, and a bum. And where does this come in with you? My audience is primarily black women, but it is applicable to everybody. There's always been in American society something called the rambling man. And no matter what else we can say about him, he just is not someone who can sit still. It's hard to build with men like that. But if you get a woman of the same temperament, she may be ready to hit the road as well. And there are. And this brings me to what I discovered. There's a channel called Hobos Shoestring. And he is, you would guess, a hobo. He's actually a very famous one because he is 50 years old, U.S. veteran, and adept with today's technology. So he hit the roads in the 1990s, and since then he's gotten a YouTube channel and got a solar charger and all this other stuff. And as it happens, a lot of men who got into the lifestyle of hobos back in the day were, after the Civil War, military men who couldn't go home and explain what they had experienced, couldn't ever be at peace in regular society again, both Confederates and Union soldiers, who began to roam the country on the new train systems looking for work. And in addition to that, during the Great Depression was another great wave. So the grandfathers and some of the older fathers who became hobos were able to then mentor the next group. And as the United States has there's been a little resurgence of hobo life since we've had 30 years of war, so you have a certain number of veterans. And you also have the Great Recession has also caused this. Has also caused a bump. So, hobo life, tramp life, bum life is back. But I remember my grandmother and my mother. I remember one conversation. I was very, very young, and I forget who it was my grandmother was protecting. He's like, no, that's not a hobo, that's a bum. And I remember they had more respect for hobos than they had for bums. And I remember that, watching movies about hobos growing up, it was still, kind of romanticized in the 1980s. And my parents are a little bit older, 1950 and 1930s. So my dad was actually born during the Great Depression when this saw a huge upsurge. So here's the difference, and it's important for you to recognize this because these archetypes of men still exist. It says in the question of race either. A hobo is a rambling man. He uses the trains, but as someone online said, basically they're homeless seasonal workers from inside the country. They go and they look for work as the seasons spread through the country, back and forth and back and forth. They don't always ride trains today. As one hobo I was reading in the comments said, today we don't usually hop trains because we're able to make enough between our YouTube channels and various streams of income to be able to support ourselves without having to do that. We just follow seasonal work. Meaning that your non-Latino day laborers traditionally have been hobos. They're willing to work. And they do things like planning out wild land, also to have foodstuffs. There's another channel called Crime Pays and Botany Doesn't, called Guerrilla Gardening. When you find foodstuffs in unusual landscapes, I kind of pay attention to that because of how much food I get out here. When you see that, just know that someone of that lifestyle may have planted it. There was a hobo camp, I think now, in a park way down the Embarcadero one day, and the spirit said, don't bother that peach tree. It didn't belong there, and it was full of peaches, but the spirit said, leave it alone, and I did, and I haven't gone back. But they're willing to work. A tramp is not generally willing to work. A hobo is willing to work, and the 15 hobo commandments also require cleaning up after self, care for the ecology, because think about the next hobo who's going to come along and going to need the same resources. So don't mess up things in the towns and in the ecology where you end up landing. Don't do that. The hobos have a code of ethics, and they generally are productive. Tramps won't work, but they won't steal either. Tramps are sort of, I imagine, the Confederate gentleman class, but then they had social graces and charms. The tramp and the gigolo overlap, but generally their code of ethics will not allow them to steal, whereas a bum won't work and will steal. Here's the payoff, y'all. none of them are going to build a family in the sense of being at home. And all of these men have decided to exist outside the prevailing laws. The first commandment of the hobo is that you decide how to live. You don't let other people decide how to live. And this is why they are, of course, now we got to move over a little bit because the sun, it feels like August, but it's definitely November. The sun is like, I gotta go. Ah! Hold on. Gotta move, get some sunlight here. Sun just be running. Okay, there we go. All of these men are lawless, that's the point I was making. They consider themselves a law unto themselves. And it is very, very difficult if a man decides that he is just not going to deal with society in terms of recognizing its authority. It is very difficult because basically that man has become a god and a law unto himself. But of these men, the hobo type is the most productive. But in essence, that's the same person. Very, very difficult to build a family with a man like that. But at least he works. So if you have to deal with men outside society, if you feel that you are exiled to that extent, the tramp is charming, but he ain't gonna do nothing. And of course, the bum will steal and will not work. Now, I mention this because Sir Walter Jones has given us the, how shall I say it, the trope of the hobosexual, hobo with B. A man who is essentially a rambling man, but he will lay up with a woman for the winter. I see in comments, some people would tell a hobo shoestring, what you need to do is get you a large woman and lay up with her into the spring. I told you tramps and gigolos overlap. I don't see that as much with hobo culture because there's hobo men and hobo women. You really have to have a desire, at least traditional. You really have to have a desire for a hard life. And you wouldn't settle down and get comfortable because you wouldn't settle down and get comfortable. Hobo Shoestring is in his 50s now. He actually does have an apartment. At least he did. And he's actually, at this stage of his life, in the process of moving to Alaska. So when he comes down into the lower 48, he's basically coming down to visit friends and relatives because sometimes he still wants to ride. It's a way of life for him. But he makes enough from his YouTube and the kindness of real friends that he's made. And he seems like a very kind gentleman. Kind and nice gentleman. The thing about it is, he's still lawless. But people feel like because of tradition, we're going to excuse that. And that's fine as long as you're not married to it. And that was the point of this video. There will always be rambling men. Hobo Shoestring talked about, being undiagnosed for some autism, and some Asperger's potentially. And being in motion, having to do what he does, he lived for 30 years on the rails, survived outdoors after military service for 30 years. He said, it focuses my mind. It gives me enough to do so I'm not constantly talking about this over here and this over there. My mind isn't running from place to place. 1 minute I'm thinking about something that happened 12 years ago. The next minute I'm thinking about where I'm going to. He describes a lot of things that go with people who are neurodivergent. So to be fair, a lot of men and women who have gotten into these lifestyles, if we could have sat down and really talked to them with today's medical care, what we would have found out is that they were neurodivergent and this society offers them no support. That's a fact. And people who are neurodivergent end up outside in various ways. But you just have to know what you're working with. These are lawless men to various degrees of productivity. And their archetypes exist in the black community as well. In all kindness and fairness, again, you have to look at neurodivergence. A lot of men who came from this lifestyle of every race are people that just could not. All the way back to Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. The last thing Huckleberry Finn says as he leaves, he's still a boy, but he just can't let himself become civilized. And he's probably in a good situation, but he knows he's probably going to have to leave it again. And Huck Finn is about 14 years old. Well, Mark Twain, who wrote that, knew what was going on. a lot of these men would become hobos. And if you read Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, they're going down the rivers and all these things that you did before trains were a huge matter. And they're living life and dealing with the challenges that they find. And they end up saving the life of someone else who was going through this, an escaped slave. This is a long thread. A lot of the people that came to the United States of America came here because they were not able to fit into the structures of European society. So this is the thing. It is an archetype for men that we don't often talk about, so I'm sharing it. Just know, unless you are a woman who also is outside, it's not going to work. Even the productive ones are not going to work. Now, I've read comments of men who have women and children, wives. It does sometimes happen that are willing to go with them across the country. And I have read stories where hobos had families and daughters, and one or more of their children ended up going with their fathers on the route. It does happen sometimes because the hobo is productive. It can happen sometimes, and sometimes also neurodivergence is hereditary. There's a lot of stories like this. I go back and I think about the stories I've read in American history and how some things are romanticized. Now I understand. Neurodivergence is a thing, more so among men than women, it looks like. Certain types. But just know that those archetypes are still running, and don't take any of them in for the winter. I'm just saying. We're not having it, like I said, because it's more complicated than it appears. But just don't. Don't be the large woman that a man lays up under, planning on when he's going to leave you and go somewhere else in the spring. Just don't be that woman. That doesn't have to be your lifestyle. Now you know. All right. Y'all have a good day now. I actually have another one I'm going to do as well. Anybody interested in how to get out of a $25 million problem? That's next. Bye. Thank you for listening.